"Daddy, I brought you a present for Christmas," said the little girl, pointing at the Apache widow. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The snow had settled thick across the Colorado foothills by the time morning light reached the ridge. There was no drift, no shifting of powder, just a heavy, unmoving blanket that covered the roofs, the fence rails, and the open ground stretching toward the pines. The air carried the kind of sharp cold that made a man's breath sting on the way out. The ranch below the ridge looked small but steady, built from thick-cut pine boards that had weathered 3 winters and still held firm. Grant Holloway stepped out from the barn with a hammer tucked under one arm and a strip of rawhide hanging from his coat pocket. His beard was stiff with frost, and his shoulders lifted and dropped with each breath he pushed into the cold. He walked with the controlled pace of someone who knew how to work through harsh weather without wasting motion. Grant had never been the kind of man who hurried unless danger pushed him. After 20 years as a U.S. Marshal, tracking killers, settling disputes, burying too many memories, he now chose a life that required quiet hands and steady thinking instead of gunfights. He bought this land because it sat far from any saloon, rail line, or outlaw trail. He built the cabin because he wanted a place where his daughter wouldn't hear gunfire in the distance or see men dragged from the jailhouse. His mission now was simple: raise his daughter in peace and avoid anything that could bring violence back to his doorstep. He reached the barn door hinge and examined the crack left from last week's windstorm. The wood had split unevenly near the joint, and each time the door swung, it groaned. Grant pressed his thumb along the break, studying whether it could hold another season or if he needed to replace the entire beam. His jaw tightened the way it always did when he worked through problems quietly. He lifted the hammer, drove a nail in, and listened to the way the sound bounced along the boards. Behind him, the cabin door shut softly, but he didn't turn. That sound belonged to Mira, and she had a very specific way of moving, quick, curious, always drifting towards something she wanted to explore. Grant checked the tree line briefly and saw her small figure heading toward the creek again. Her coat hung open, and her scarf already sagged off one shoulder. He let her go but kept her in his mind. Her curiosity made her bright and spirited, but it also meant she wandered more than he liked. She had lost her mother at 4 years old, and since then he had worked twice as hard to keep her world safe. That meant teaching her to watch the land, judge the weather, and stay within sight lines. Today, she pushed those limits again. Grant planned to call her back once he secured the hinge. The snow crunched under his boots as he moved around the door to test the frame. He ran his hand along the edge, checking for loose fibers. The cold settled deeper into his coat, but he kept working through it. Hard labor kept him grounded. As long as his hands were busy, his mind didn't drift toward the old gunfights or the mistakes that followed him even out here. When he straightened and glanced toward the creek again, his breath caught mid-exhale. Mira was returning through the snow, but she wasn't alone. She held the hand of an unfamiliar woman, barefoot, shivering, and visibly close to collapse. Grant stiffened. The hammer in his hand lowered but didn't drop. His feet shifted apart slightly, not in threat, but in preparation. His instincts sharpened the way they used to whenever he approached a camp where he didn't know who was armed or desperate. Mira waved with her free hand. "Daddy," her voice carried across the quiet land. "I brought you a Christmas present." Grant's jaw locked. He moved toward them slowly, each step steady and controlled, assessing the situation in the same methodical way he once evaluated crime scenes. The woman beside Mira was young, perhaps 25, with bronze skin dulled by cold and exhaustion. Her deerskin dress had torn across the neckline, exposing a deep line of cleavage and the bruising along her collarbone. The side seam dangled open from a ripped stitch. Her hair, long and black, hung tangled across her shoulders with beads and a single feather half frozen against the strands. She clutched her arms over her chest, not modestly, but simply to trap what little warmth she had left. Her bare feet were red and raw, her legs shaking with each step. Every line of her posture signaled severe fatigue. Her eyes, though tired, tracked Grant's movements closely, ready to react if he appeared threatening. Mira held on to her with both small hands, tugging gently to keep her upright. Grant crouched the moment they reached him. "Where did you find her?" His tone was calm, but edged with tension. "By the creek," Mira said. "She was so cold she could barely stand. She didn't have shoes. She needed help." Grant rose at a controlled pace. His attention shifted fully to the woman. "What's your name?" he asked. The woman hesitated, as if weighing whether answering him was safe. "Anika," she finally said, her voice hoarse. "How long were you out in this weather?" "2 nights. Maybe more. I ran when they killed my husband. Men were selling women. I didn't know where else to go." Her eyes dropped as she spoke, her shoulders tightened, and her breath shuddered from the effort of talking. Grant noted each detail, the way she swayed slightly, the torn fabric near her ribs, the faint marks on her wrist that hinted at bindings. She was telling the truth. He also knew she couldn't stay outside another minute without risking frostbite or worse. Grant's thoughts moved quickly. Is she being hunted? Are the men who chased her close? Is bringing her inside safe for Mira? Can he turn away someone this close to death? The last question answered itself. He reached a decision the same way he approached every dangerous situation, with careful steps and full awareness of the risks. "Follow me," he said. "The cabin's warm." Anika blinked in disbelief, then nodded once. She leaned slightly toward Mira for balance as the child led her toward the porch. Inside, the warmth hit Anika instantly. Her body loosened in a way that showed how much pain she'd been holding back. She looked around the cabin as if unsure she was allowed to sit anywhere. Grant shut the door and stomped snow from his boots. He removed his coat and hung it on the wall peg. The room was small but organized, with stove, table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with jars of beans, and Myra's drawings pinned along the far wall. Grant pulled out a chair. "Sit before you fall." Anika lowered herself slowly, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the blanket Mira draped over her shoulders. Her breathing deepened slightly, the first sign of relief she'd shown. Grant ladled warm broth into a bowl and set it in front of her. "Take your time. Too fast will make you sick." Anika lifted the spoon with both hands. Steam rose toward her face. She took a careful sip, then a second, each one bringing a small change in her expression. Relief mixed with disbelief that she was finally safe, even temporarily. Mira sat beside her, eyes bright. "You can stay for Christmas," she said. "Daddy won't make you go back outside." Grant didn't interrupt. He didn't promise anything either. He simply watched the way Anika held the bowl, the way she fought to keep her hand steady, the way she kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to storm inside. Snow tapped lightly against the window. The fire crackled in the stove. And for the first time in a long while, Grant felt the cabin shift from a silent shelter into something slightly warmer. An unexpected reminder that even after years of grief and isolation, life could place someone in front of him who needed protection more than he needed solitude. The cabin held a quiet warmth as the fire settled into a steady burn, its glow reaching the corners of the room where shadows lingered. Anika finished the last sip of broth, her fingers still trembling from cold and hunger, and placed the tin bowl gently on the table. Grant stood a short distance away, leaning one hand on the counter while he watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with the focused attention of a man who needed answers before nightfall. He saw the uncertainty in her posture and the instinctive way she kept the blanket tight around her shoulders, and he knew she expected him to question her soon. She was right. Mira slipped off her chair, eager and curious, and hurried to her small box of pencils in the corner. She wanted to draw their new guest the same way she drew birds and deer tracks, but Grant caught her eye and gave her a look that told her to give them space. Mira sat on the rug instead, humming faintly and pretending not to listen, though every muscle in her small body leaned toward the table. Grant pulled out the second chair and lowered himself into it with a slow, controlled movement. "You're safe for now," he said, keeping his voice even. "But I need to understand what happened before you came here. The land isn't as empty as it looks, and danger travels faster than snow. Anika's hands tightened around the blanket. Her gaze flicked nervously between Grant and the stove, as if grounding herself in the steady warmth before she spoke. My husband and I lived near the canyon rim east of here, she said quietly. We stayed away from towns. We only traded when we had to. A group of men passed through 4 nights ago. They weren't from any tribe I knew. They had wagons and rifles. They wanted women. Her jaw clenched, and she paused to steady her breath. They came into our camp before dawn. My husband fought them. They shot him. I ran toward the pines. I didn't stop until I reached the creek yesterday morning. Grant listened without interrupting, his expression controlled but intense. Mira looked up from the floor, her face softening with concern. She crawled closer, placing a hand on Anika's knee. Anika flinched at the touch, reflexively, then exhaled slowly and offered Mira a faint, grateful nod. Grant continued. How many men were there? 5, Anika answered. One older, the others younger. They moved like they'd done this before. They weren't hiding it. Grant's fingers tapped the table once. His mind moved through possibilities: outlaws, deserters, traitors, or men running from something worse. He had dealt with men like that back when he carried a badge. They didn't abandon their pursuits easily. Did they follow you? He asked, keeping his voice low so Mira wouldn't hear the weight behind the question. I don't know, Anika whispered. I didn't hear horses after the first mile. I saw no tracks, but I didn't look back. Grant leaned back in his chair, not because he was relaxed, but because he needed space to think without crowding her. He had to decide how much risk she brought to the ranch, and if the men who killed her husband were still close enough to threaten them. Every decision he made now had to protect Mira before anything else. He studied Anika carefully. She wasn't lying. Her expression carried too many raw edges: fear that hadn't settled, grief she hadn't processed, and exhaustion that went deeper than hunger. She wasn't a danger. She was a survivor trying to breathe. Your feet, he said, shifting his focus, they're frostbitten at the toes. He rose from the chair, moved to the shelf, and retrieved a small tin of salve. Anika's eyebrows knit with confusion. Grant knelt, setting the tin on the floor. Let me see. She hesitated, instinctively drawing her legs in, but Mira scooted forward. Daddy helps people, Mira said plainly. He fixed my hand when I cut on the fence. He'll fix yours too. Anika exhaled, tension loosening just enough. She lowered her feet one at a time onto the small rug. Grant's jaw tightened slightly when he saw the raw, cracked skin. He unscrewed the tin and applied the salve with careful strokes. His gloves were still cold from outside, and Anika gasped quietly when his fingers brushed her skin. He paused. Does it hurt too much? He asked. No, she murmured. It only surprised me. Grant continued with slower movements, his touch steady. He wasn't comfortable with the closeness. His shoulders stiffened and his breath shortened, but he didn't pull away. He had patched wounds before, but touching a stranger's bare skin after years of guarding his emotions made something inside him shift uneasily. When he finished, he wrapped her feet in strips of cloth and stood. You'll walk better by morning. Anika nodded once, her eyes lingering on him longer than before. She seemed to be studying the man who had shown her a kindness she hadn't expected. There was confusion in her gaze, mixed with something heavier, recognition of safety she hadn't felt since before her husband died. Mira tugged Anika's hand again. You should see my drawings, she said, excitement bubbling up. I made one a horse with really long legs. Grant cleared his throat. Mira, he said, tone gentle but firm, give her a moment. Mira sighed dramatically and went back to her corner. Grant turned to Anika again. You need rest. We'll decide what comes next when daylight's better. A small silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just cautious. Then Anika spoke in a voice almost too soft to catch. Why did you help me? Grant didn't answer immediately. He had asked himself the same thing since she walked across the snow with his daughter beside her. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want strangers. He didn't want reminders of the violence he spent half a lifetime escaping. But he also knew what happened to people left outside in winter. You were freezing, he finally said. and my daughter trusts you. That's enough for now." Anika lowered her eyes, the faintest tremor running through her shoulders. Grant looked away quickly before the moment grew too heavy. He stirred the fire, added a few logs, and checked the latch on the door. Old instincts rose in him. The urge to watch the windows, keep the rifle close, and listen for anything that didn't belong in the snow. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls. Inside, the presence of a scared woman and a hopeful child changed the air in ways Grant didn't yet know how to handle. The night ahead would bring questions he wasn't ready for. But for now, the cabin held 3 people instead of 2, and that alone shifted the world in a way none of them fully understood yet. The fire burned lower as afternoon faded, its glow turning from bright gold to a deep orange that stretched across the cabin floor. Grant checked the stove, fed in another log, and lowered the latch. He kept watch on the space around Anika without making it obvious, noting how her breathing had steadied since eating and how the tension in her shoulders had shifted into something closer to guarded fatigue. Mira sat with her, showing drawings one after another, pointing at stick-figure horses and tiny houses with crooked roofs. Grant let them share the moment without interruption. He needed time to think clearly, and he stepped outside long enough to check the yard. The cold hit hard the moment he opened the door. Snow had settled again over the fence line, the kind that hid tracks quickly. He scanned the ridge, the tree line, and the frozen trail leading toward the creek. Nothing moved. No stray horses. No prints that didn't belong. Yet his instincts stayed sharp. Men who took women didn't usually give up after one chase, and Grant knew that if they were still in the region, he needed to be ready long before night took hold. He returned inside, shutting the wind behind him, and set his gloves beside the stove to dry. Mira glanced up at him, then continued her drawing explanation with Anika, who sat wrapped in a blanket with the kind of stiffness that came from trying not to show pain. Grant could see she was still freezing beneath the fabric, so he reached for another quilt from the chest and set it beside her without a word. Anika's eyes flickered upward. "Thank you," she said quietly. She didn't look away this time. Grant nodded once, then turned his attention to the corner where his rifle hung. He lifted it, checked the chamber, and leaned it against the wall within arm's reach. Mira watched him with a question forming in her eyes. "Is something coming?" she asked, tone serious now. "Not yet," Grant said, "but I need to be prepared." Mira pressed her lips together and scooted closer to Anika, as if her presence alone could keep trouble away. Anika placed a hand lightly on the girl's back, a gesture both cautious and protective, and the touch surprised her. She hadn't touched anyone with calm intent since before her husband died. Grant saw the moment pass between them and realized something else needed answering. Something he hadn't asked but knew mattered. "Anika," he said, pulling a chair near the table, "before we plan anything for tomorrow, I need to know if you have any family nearby. Anyone who might be looking for you." Anika shook her head slowly. "No one this far north. My people moved south after the last treaty. My husband and I stayed because we didn't want to return. The land there was crowded. Here we had quiet." Her voice tightened. "No one else survived the raid." Grant didn't respond right away. He let the information settle. Mira reached for Anika's hand again, and this time Anika didn't flinch. The girl's small fingers wrapped around her palm like she'd known her forever. Grant cleared his throat. "All right," he said. "Then until we know who's riding these hills, you stay here. I'll figure out tomorrow what needs doing." Anika blinked with uncertainty. "I don't want to bring danger to your home." "Danger finds its own road," Grant replied. "But freezing to death outside solves nothing." The comment landed heavier than he expected, and he saw emotion rise in her expression, something like guilt mixed with relief. She looked down, struggling to keep herself composed after days of fear. Grant recognized it because he'd seen the same look in survivors he pulled from ambush sites years ago. Mira tugged Anika's sleeve. "Do you need clothes? Daddy has extra fabric." Anika hesitated. "If there is anything you can spare." "The dress is ruined." Grant nodded, stood, and opened the wooden chest near the bed. Inside were spare shirts, blankets, and 2 dresses he had kept from Myra's mother because Mira insisted on saving them. He paused for a moment, aware that touching those clothes always carried its own weight, then selected a soft linen underdress and a wool layer that would fit Anika loosely. "These should do for now," he said, setting them beside her. Anika brushed her fingers over the fabric, her face shifting from apprehension to a quiet gratitude that made her shoulders lower slightly. She wasn't used to being given anything without conditions. She looked up, unsure what to say. Grant stepped back to give her space, but he kept his tone steady. "You can wash up behind the curtain by the water basin. Mira, stay out until she's finished." Mira nodded quickly, though curiosity sparkled in her eyes. While Anika moved toward the basin, Grant busied himself chopping vegetables for stew, giving her privacy without drifting far. He heard the slight clink of the basin, the rustle of fabric, and the soft hiss when cold water touched her skin. She worked quietly, careful not to splash. When she returned, her hair unbraided and damp at the ends, she wore the clean linen dress under the wool layer, and for the first time she didn't look like she was moments from collapsing. She looked like someone who had survived something that should have killed her. Mira clapped her hands. "You look warmer." A faint, genuine smile touched Anika's lips. A small expression, but stronger than anything she'd shown earlier. Grant stirred the pot and spoke without turning. "You'll sleep on the bed tonight. I'll take the floor by the stove." Anika's steps halted. "I can't take your bed." "It's not a discussion," Grant replied. "You're injured. You need real rest." She studied him, searching for any sign of impatience or hidden motive. She found none, only a tired man doing what needed doing. It unsettled her more than threats ever had. Night settled fully against the windows. The wind pushed softly at the logs in the walls. Grant ladled stew into bowls, set them on the table, and let Mira sit between them. Anika ate slowly, savoring every taste, careful not to overfill her empty stomach. Grant watched her for a moment, only a moment, before shifting his gaze to the door latch again. He needed to check the land before they slept. He needed to confirm what direction the danger might come from. He also needed to accept that he wasn't alone in this cabin now, and that meant every plan he formed had to account for a frightened woman and a trusting child. After dinner, Mira fell asleep beside the stove with her pencil still in her hand. Grant lifted her gently, carried her to the bed, and tucked her under the quilts. Anika stood beside him, unsure if she should lie down yet. "You should rest," Grant said. "You'll feel the cold again once the fire dies down." Anika nodded and slipped carefully into the bed's edge, pulling the quilts over herself. She watched Grant gather a blanket for the floor, his movements efficient and practiced. As he sat near the fire with a rifle beside him, Anika found the courage to speak again. "Will you keep watch tonight?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he answered without hesitation. Her eyes softened. "Why help me this much?" Grant looked toward the window, where darkness hid anything that might be moving across the land. "Because my daughter walked you here," he said simply, "and because I'm not the kind of man who lets someone freeze when I can stop it." The room settled into stillness. Anika lowered her head onto the pillow. Grant shifted slightly on the floor, alert but calm. Mira breathed softly in her sleep. Outside, the snow held every secret of the ridge. Inside, 3 people lay under the same roof. One asleep, one guarded, one awake and listening for anything that didn't belong. And for the first time since the raid, Anika closed her eyes without bracing for footsteps in the dark. Grant stayed awake long after the fire dipped to a softer glow, the embers pulsing with a steady red heartbeat across the room. He sat with his back against the wall, rifle within reach, eyes shifting between the window and the quiet figures on the bed. Mira slept curled at the edge, her breath shallow and peaceful. Anika rested beside her, still as a wounded animal finally given cover, though every so often she stirred with the instinctive flinch of someone accustomed to danger. The cabin was silent except for the faint crackle of wood settling in the stove. Outside, wind moved across the ridge, brushing snow into thin waves that drifted toward the barn. Grant listened to each gust carefully, waiting for anything that sounded like hooves or boots or a wagon cutting through frozen ground. Nothing came. Even so, he didn't fully lower his guard. By the time the sky outside softened into the gray before sunrise, Grant's neck ached from staying upright, but he didn't shift until he heard the first sign of movement behind him. Anika pushing herself slowly upright. She blinked toward the window, taking in the faint light. For a moment, she looked disoriented, unsure if the safety she had felt the night before was real. Then she noticed Mira still sleeping beside her, warm and unharmed, and her shoulders loosened. She caught sight of Grant sitting by the stove and realized he had kept watch the entire night. "You didn't sleep," Anika said, her voice low. "Didn't need to," Grant replied, not moving from his spot. She watched him a moment longer, feeling something unfamiliar, an unexpected sense of being protected without being controlled. It unsettled her in ways she didn't understand yet. Before she could speak again, Mira rolled over and blinked her eyes open. When she saw Anika awake, she smiled immediately. "Good morning." Anika's breath caught at the child's warmth. She managed a small nod. "Good morning." Grant rose to his feet, joints stiff from the floor. He stretched subtly and reached for his coat. "I'm checking the ridge before the sun climbs," he said. "Stay inside until I'm back." Mira frowned. "Are you looking for bad men?" Grant didn't answer directly. "I'm making sure the land's quiet," he said, fastened his coat, and stepped outside. The door shut with a firm thud, and Anika flinched lightly at the sound. Mira noticed. "He always checks the land," she said matter-of-factly. "He wants us safe." The words settled into Anika, bringing questions she hadn't voiced. Why did this man carry responsibility so heavily? Why did he choose to live far from towns? Why did he seem more comfortable facing danger than sharing a table? While Mira dressed for the morning, Anika rose and approached the basin again, wanting to wash the stiffness from her face and neck. Her feet still hurt, but the salve had eased the worst of it. She glanced briefly at the torn deerskin dress folded near the bed and wondered if she should mend it or burn it. The memories attached to it were sharp, and she didn't know if wearing it again would help her heal or push her backward. She needed answers from Grant, too. If the men who killed her husband might be searching the area, why they had targeted her camp, and what would happen if those men came to the ranch. But she would wait until he returned. Asking too much at once risked breaking the fragile safety that had formed overnight. Outside, Grant walked the perimeter of the property with slow, heavy steps, scanning for anything out of place. The sun had barely begun to rise, leaving the snow with a bluish tint. He found no tracks except the ones Mira made yesterday and faint imprint from where they brought Anika inside. Near the ridge, he crouched and examined the snow more closely. A single indentation, small, subtle, but too sharp to be natural, caught his attention. It wasn't from his boots, not from Mira, and not from Anika's bare feet. It looked like someone had stepped there hours earlier, maybe before the night sky fully darkened. Grant's jaw tightened. He followed the shallow line until it faded at the tree line. Whoever left it hadn't come near the house, but they had passed close enough to notice the smoke from the chimney if they were paying attention. He didn't like the implication. Someone was on foot. Someone who moved quietly. Someone who didn't approach the ranch, but came near enough to track movement. Grant returned to the cabin with the information heavy in his mind. Inside, Mira and Anika were preparing the table, Mira chatting about the stray cat she saw 2 weeks ago, Anika listening with polite interest. But when Grant stepped through the door, both turned toward him. Mira immediately read his face and fell silent. Anika studied his expression carefully. "What did you see?" Grant shut the door slowly, hung his coat, and spoke with a calmness that didn't hide the seriousness of his words. "Someone crossed the ridge. Only one set of tracks. Not a horse. Not a wagon. Just a single traveler." Myra's eyes widened. "Are they coming here?" "No sign of that," Grant said. "But someone passed close enough to see this cabin." Anika lifted a hand to her throat, unable to stop the tension rising in her chest. "Do you think it's one of them?" "It's possible," Grant admitted. "Or it could be a hunter or someone heading toward the canyon. But I won't assume anything." He paused, then added something he hadn't explained the day before. "I lived through too many raids and ambushes during my years as a marshal. I don't take chances anymore." The missing piece clicked in Anika's mind. His watchfulness, his distance, his sharp instincts. None of it was simple caution. It was survival learned the hard way. Grant moved toward the rifle and checked the chamber again. If someone's watching, they may be waiting to see who comes and goes, which means no one leaves until I know who they are. Mira stepped closer to Anika and took her hand, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Anika squeezed back gently. Grant noticed the gesture and paused. He hadn't expected them to connect this fast. He wasn't sure how he felt about it yet, but he knew it changed things. Protecting his daughter meant protecting the woman the girl had already accepted as part of their home. Anika swallowed once, then asked the question she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. If they come, what will you do? Grant lifted his eyes toward her, and for the first time since she arrived, he let her see the part of him he usually kept buried. I'll do whatever it takes to keep this house safe. His tone carried no threat, only truth. Anika felt something shift in her chest. Fear, relief, and something softer she didn't want to name yet. Grant turned back to the window, scanning the ridge again. His voice lowered, steady and sure. We prepare. We stay inside. And until I know who's out there, nobody faces the cold alone. The cabin held a new kind of silence. One shaped not by fear, but by the weight of 3 lives now tied together, whether any of them planned it or not. Grant didn't stay still after he spotted the tracks on the ridge. The moment he set his rifle aside, he moved to the shelf where he kept a small metal box, one filled with old martial tools he hadn't touched in years. He didn't want to open it, but he needed the items inside more than he liked admitting. Anika watched from the table, unsure if she was allowed to ask what he was doing. Mira stood close to her, sensing tension even if she didn't fully understand its cause. Grant flipped the latch on the box and lifted out a compact spyglass, a worn journal with pages filled from his martial days, and a folded canvas map of the foothills. He spread the map across the table, pressing the corners flat. Anika leaned slightly forward, drawn to the unfamiliar markings. Mira climbed onto her toes beside her, inspecting the lines with exaggerated curiosity. This is the ridge line, Grant said, tapping a finger along a thick pencil stroke. And this is where you came from. The creek runs here. He drew a line from west to east. The track I found was north of the fence, closer to the older hunting trail. Anika studied the map carefully. She noticed something that hadn't come up yet, a gap in the ridge where the canyon dipped lower. She pointed at the spot. They came through here, she said. 2 nights ago, when they found our camp, they arrived from this direction. Grant shifted closer. Are you certain? Yes, she said softly. They moved along the ridge to avoid leaving prints in the open. Grant's jaw tightened. Then the track I found lines up too well to ignore. Mira looked from Grant to Anika with wide eyes. Does that mean the bad men are close? Grant didn't answer immediately. He knelt beside Mira instead, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. It means someone walked near us, but it doesn't tell us who. We're going to stay calm and think through it. His voice stayed steady, but Anika caught the tension in his posture, the way he kept glancing toward the window, as if expecting the land to shift. While Mira returned to her drawings, Grant motioned Anika toward the cabin's corner. He unhooked a wooden partition from the wall and unfolded it, forming a temporary screen around the bed area. You'll have a separate space, he said. Myra's at an age where privacy matters, and you need a place you can feel safe. Anika touched the edge of the screen, surprised by the thoughtfulness. No one had offered her privacy since before her husband's death. She looked up at Grant. Thank you. Grant nodded once, then moved toward the stove to prepare breakfast. His hand stayed steady, but his thoughts ran with sharp edges. He didn't want to scare Anika, but he needed more details, something that could tell him whether the men she fled were trained riders, drifters, or worse. He knew from experience that each type approached danger differently. While he cracked eggs into a pan, he asked, what did the leader look like? Anika's expression tightened. Tall, weathered face. He wore a coat with a black stripe across one arm. The younger ones listened to him like they were soldiers. Grant paused with the pan halfway over the fire. A stripe on the arm, he repeated, his voice dropping slightly. Did he have a scar across his chin? Anika's eyes widened. Yes. Grant set the pan down slowly, his shoulders tensing. His name is Rowe. Micah Rowe. He's not a traitor. He's a trafficker. Used to work with deserter gangs near the border. Men like him don't wander this far north unless they're running from something. Anika's breath caught. He killed my husband. Grant didn't soften his tone. If Rowe is near, he's not alone. He travels with men who work for coin and don't care what trouble they make. Anika swallowed hard, fear rippling beneath her calm. If he saw smoke from the chimney, he might just avoid the place completely, Grant said. Or he might watch from a distance before deciding whether it's worth approaching. Mira looked up again, picking up on the tension even though she didn't understand the details. She crawled onto Anika's lap and leaned against her, offering comfort in the only way she knew. Anika held her gently, surprised by how natural the motion felt. Grant turned back to the stove, pushing the conversation into a more practical direction. If Rowe is nearby, the first thing he'll look for is signs of camp. We need to cut the smoke tomorrow morning. I'll bank the fire lower and insulate the chimney cap so it's harder to see from a ridge. Anika watched him, studying how he thought through every angle. You've dealt with men like him before. Grant didn't look away from the pan. Too many times. A silence settled briefly, broken only by the sizzle in the skillet. Anika realized something else the listeners might wonder. Why Grant lived alone out here, why he didn't rely on neighbors or nearby towns for support. She turned toward him and asked, "Is there anyone nearby you can trust?" "No," Grant said quietly. "The nearest homestead is half a day's ride. The town is farther. And after what happened to Myra's mother, I chose distance for a reason." Anika's breath softened. "Your wife." Grant cut the flame without turning. "She was killed by men I had arrested years before," he said. "They escaped. Found us. I wasn't home." His voice didn't crack, but the restraint was heavy. "That's why I brought Mira here. Less noise. Fewer eyes. Fewer chances for someone to mistake us for easy prey." Anika lowered her gaze, understanding now why Grant had built his life around vigilance. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. It was guilt. It was a father trying to outrun a past he couldn't erase. Grant served the food and set the plates on the table. Mira ate cheerfully, unaware of the weight behind the adult silence. Anika ate slower, processing everything she had learned. After breakfast, Grant pulled on his coat and checked the powder in his rifle. "I'm sweeping the lower creek trail," he said. "I want to see if tracks lead west. Should I come?" Anika asked before she could stop herself, instinctively wanting to help rather than hide. "No," Grant said gently but firmly. "Your feet aren't ready, and I won't risk you running into Rowe alone." Anika nodded reluctantly. Grant stepped outside. Anika watched him through the frosted window. A lone man moving through the cold with a determination that seemed carved into him. A man who carried his ghosts in silence. A man who chose to protect her even though he owed her nothing. And for the first time since she arrived, she felt something warmer than fear settling in her chest. The beginning of trust. Grant moved along the lower creek trail with slow and measured steps, examining every break in the snow, every shadow that didn't belong, every faint shift of frost caught on bent grass. The morning air was bitter enough to numb unprotected skin, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind worked through possibilities with the same discipline he once used when tracking fugitives across canyon country. The creek was partially frozen, water pushing through narrow cracks where the ice hadn't sealed fully. Grant crouched near the bank and scanned the ground. New prints. A stray deer. A fox. But nothing shaped like a human boot. Still, the absence of fresh tracks didn't calm him. Men like Micah Rowe didn't always walk close to predictable trails. They used high ridges, tree lines, and vantage points that gave him the upper hand. He checked the eastern bend next, then the stand of fir trees that form a natural choke point. The silence felt heavier there, the isolated kind that made his instincts sharpen further. He crouched, brushing snow away from a small depression. It wasn't a full print, more like the edge of one, fresh enough to trouble him, deep enough to suggest someone had stopped briefly to scan the valley. Grant rose slowly and looked toward the distant ridge. Someone had been watching the land. Whether they saw Anika enter his cabin was still unclear. But whoever it was, they weren't passing through by accident. He turned back toward home, rifle angled across his shoulder, his pace steady but tense. The walk back took longer than the search itself because every few steps he paused to check the horizon again. By the time he reached the fence line, the cabin came into view, a small, sturdy structure with smoke rising low enough to suggest Anika had tended the fire without creating a column visible from the hills. Smart, she learned quickly. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately. Anika had swept the floor, folded Myra's blankets, and stacked kindling neatly beside the stove. Mira sat on a stool with a piece of charcoal, drawing what looked like a horse with enormous ears. When Grant stepped in, Mira looked up and ran to him. "Did you find anything?" "Not yet," Grant said, brushing snow from his coat. He glanced at Anika. "You kept the smoke low." She straightened slightly. "I didn't know if it mattered." "It does," he replied. "You made the right call." Her expression softened, a faint mix of relief and pride showing through. The more time Grant spent watching her, the more he realized she wasn't helpless. She was resilient, perceptive, and painfully unaccustomed to being valued. Grant removed his gloves and set them near the stove. "There's something else we need to go over," he said. "If those men come close, they'll look for signs of occupancy. We need to make the outside look uninteresting, like we're just a quiet ranching family, nothing worth investigating." Anika immediately stepped forward. "Tell me what to do." Grant didn't miss the urgency behind her willingness. She wasn't trying to be useful. She was trying to avoid being a burden. He recognized the instinct all too well. "You'll help Mira gather wood when the sun's higher," he said. "Keep near the cabin. If anyone approaches, come straight inside." Anika nodded firmly. "After that," Grant continued, "we'll make the yard look untouched. No fresh footprints leading outward. Nothing that suggests we're preparing for trouble." Mira raised her hand as if she were in school. "What about the track outside yesterday? The one north of the fence?" Grant crouched beside her. "That one's old enough to blend in with the wind now. But we stay careful from here on out." Anika studied him, sensing something else behind his calm explanations. "You think Roe might already know I'm here?" Grant held her gaze. "It's possible, but we handle the danger when it arrives, not before we know the shape of it." He didn't add the part weighing on his mind. The possibility that Roe wasn't alone, that he might have men circling from different directions. No sense frightening her before he had proof. By midday, the sky cleared slightly. Grant prepared to check the upper ridge, and to his surprise, Anika stepped to the door as if expecting to go with him. "You can't walk that far yet," he said. "Your feet are still healing." "I'm not afraid," she said quietly. "You don't have to be," he replied. "But I won't leave Mira alone with both of us gone." Anika glanced back at the girl, who was now drawing the cabin with enormous windows. She nodded once and stepped aside. Grant left again, scanning the ridges from a distance. Anika stayed inside, but she watched him through the frosted window every time he passed the front yard. She saw his posture, measured, rigid, alert. She saw the way he moved, like he carried weight heavier than the rifle on his shoulder. She saw the man behind the silence. When Grant finally returned, the cold clung to him in a way that made his movements stiff. Anika stepped forward before she realized she'd even moved. "You're shaking." "I'm fine," he said, though he clearly wasn't. "You didn't eat," she said. He opened his mouth to deny it, but Mira chimed in, "He always forgets when he's busy." Grant exhaled sharply, accepting defeat from an 8-year-old. Anika guided him toward the table with a determination he didn't argue with. She ladled stew from the pot and set the bowl in front of him. Grant stared at the food a moment, then at Anika. Her eyes didn't look away. Not demanding, not pleading, just expecting him to care for himself long enough to be useful. He muttered a quiet, "Thank you," and began eating. During the meal, Mira told them stories of animals she saw last summer, half-true tales mixed with childish exaggerations. Grant let Mira talk freely. Anika listened closely, a faint smile forming when Mira insisted she'd once seen a raccoon wearing snow like a hat. Grant watched Anika's reactions, noticing every shift in her expression. He also noticed the way she kept glancing at him, not with fear, but with the cautious curiosity of someone trying to understand the person protecting her. When evening approached, Grant checked the door latch one last time. Anika stood by the window, staring at the ridge, her face caught between fear of what might come and determination not to run again. "You're safe here," Grant said from behind her. She turned slowly. "I want to believe that." "You will," he said. Anika studied him, really studied him. The man who guarded his guilt like a locked box. The man who built a quiet life only to risk it for a stranger his daughter brought home. "You lost more than your wife that night," she said softly. Grant stiffened. "That's not something you need to worry about." She stepped closer, careful with her tone. "It explains why you watch every shadow, why you stay awake when others sleep." Grant didn't answer. She didn't push. The silence between them felt heavier than the space itself. Not uncomfortable, just honest. When Mira finally crawled into bed, exhausted from the day, Grant stepped back, giving Anika the edge of the room. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow we make the house look quiet as snow." Anika nodded, pulling the quilt up to her shoulders. She lay down slowly, aware. Grant stood vigilant near the stove again, rifle close, eyes sharp. Her breathing steadied. Her heartbeat slowed, and as she drifted into sleep, she realized something that startled her. She didn't feel alone anymore. Grant remained awake a little longer, watching the ridge through the window. And though the danger still hovered unseen, the cabin felt less like a place of fear and more like the beginning of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Connection. The storm arrived without warning in the middle of the night, the kind that pushed snow sideways and hammered the cabin walls hard enough to wake even the deepest sleeper. Grant rose immediately, boots sliding on the floor as he checked the door frame for drafts. Wind roared along the ridge, making the chimney creak. Mira stirred under the quilts, but didn't wake. Anika opened her eyes slowly, alert but quiet, watching Grant move with the precision of a man who had lived through nights far worse than this. He pressed his hand along the window frame, feeling for cold air slipping through. The gusts outside made the glass tremble. "Storm's heavier than I expected," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Anika pushed herself upright. Her hair had dried in soft waves overnight, falling loose around her shoulders. "Will it be dangerous?" "It depends," Grant replied. "Bad weather hides sound. If anyone's out there, we won't hear them until they're close." The words unsettled her, but she didn't panic. She knew that fear did nothing but steal clarity. Instead, she stood slowly, careful of her healing feet, and moved toward the stove to add wood. Grant watched her briefly, noticing how she had begun to read the space, how she moved with purpose, how she reached for tasks without being asked, how she tried to lighten his burden without making him feel crowded. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed everything. As the storm intensified, Grant fetched a lantern and lit it, setting it on the table to keep the shadows from swallowing the room. The light revealed something new he had missed the night before. A small bruise along Anika's upper arm, shaped like fingers. She hadn't mentioned it. She hadn't complained. But the mark explained why she winced earlier when she carried firewood. Grant stepped closer. "Who grabbed you there?" he asked, eyes fixed on the bruise. Anika's breath hitched for a moment. "One of Rose's men. He pulled me toward the wagon. I broke free before they tied me." Grant's jaw tightened, and his grip on the lantern stiffened slightly. "If he touched you like that, he won't hesitate to return." He paused, then added something he hadn't said before. "Men who take women always notice when one escapes. They don't let that go." Her expression shifted, not fear, but a steady acceptance of harsh truth. "I know." Grant exhaled through his nose and looked toward the storm again. "If Roe is near, this weather gives him cover." Anika stepped closer without thinking. "What do we do?" Grant locked eyes with her. "We prepare for the possibility he's already tracking this place." Before she could respond, Mira woke with a sudden cry, startled by a burst of wind slamming against the shutters. Anika reacted first, sitting beside her and placing a gentle hand on her back. "It's only the storm," she whispered. "You're safe." Mira clung to her, calming slowly. Grant watched them, something tightening and loosening inside him at once. Anika's presence steadied the child in ways he didn't expect. It also made him realize how quickly the cabin had shifted from the quiet isolation he'd forced onto himself into something that resembled a family. Uneven, improvised, but undeniably real. When Mira returned to sleep, the storm kept pounding. Grant paced once across the cabin, trying to confront the question he had avoided for days. What exactly Roe wanted from the land between the canyon and the foothills. The listeners would wonder too. They needed the truth. Grant stopped pacing. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said, voice firm. Roe wasn't just moving women to sell. He was trading information. The kind outlaw captains kill for. Anika's eyes lifted sharply. "What kind of information?" "Routes," Grant said. "Troop movements. Safe valleys. Places to hide." "Before I retired, I intercepted a message that listed Roe as a carrier. He vanished before we could arrest him." She stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. "So he recognizes you." "Possibly," Grant said. "If he sees me, he'll know exactly who I am." "And that puts Mira at risk," Anika said quietly. Grant nodded once, the truth settling heavier than the storm outside. Anika stepped closer, unable to stop the instinct that pushed her forward. "Then don't face him alone." Grant's eyes snapped toward hers, surprised. "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment he tried to take me," she said. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It simply met his with equal strength. He didn't answer immediately. Something passed between them. Something unspoken but undeniable. A recognition of shared danger. Shared grief. Shared responsibility in a world that took too much from both of them. Finally, Grant spoke, voice lower than before. "If I let you help, it puts you in his path." "I've already been in his path," she replied. "I survived once. I can survive again." Grant looked away, not because he disagreed, but because her resolve hit him unexpectedly hard. Her courage wasn't loud. It wasn't reckless. It was the kind born from loss and endurance. The wind slammed again, forcing snow against the door in sharp waves. Grant moved to brace it with a wooden beam, and Anika helped lift the other end. Their hands brushed briefly, a touch that sent a quick, tense breath through both of them. Neither commented on it, but neither ignored it either. When the beam was set, Grant turned to her again. "There's another thing we haven't addressed," he said. "If Roe finds this cabin, he'll recognize your dress from the raid. Even torn, he'll know it's the same material." Anika's breath caught. "Then I should destroy it." "No," Grant said. "We keep it hidden. If I need proof it was you he chased, that dress will confirm it." She nodded slowly, understanding the logic, even though the thought of preserving that memory made her chest tighten. As night settled deeper, the storm slowly shifted from violent to steady. Grant dimmed the lantern, but he didn't lie down. Anika watched him from the bed, unable to sleep with the storm still pressing against the walls. "Grant," she said softly. He turned his head slightly. "You're carrying all this on your own," she continued. "Let me carry some of it too." Grant stared at her for a long moment. Long enough that the storm outside seemed to still. "You've carried more than your share already," he said. "But if things turn bad, I won't turn away what you offer." Anika lowered her gaze, feeling warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Grant sat near the stove again, rifle across his lap. Anika rested on the bed, Myra's small frame curled beside her. And as the storm finally eased in a quiet snowfall, Grant realized something he hadn't admitted until now. He was no longer guarding two strangers. He was protecting the closest thing to a future he had allowed himself to imagine in years. The storm ended just before dawn, leaving a pale, washed-out light that reflected off the snow in sharp angles. The air outside the cabin felt colder than the night before, but the wind had calmed, and the ridges stood quiet and clear. Grant opened the door carefully, letting only a thin strip of light in while his eyes scanned the yard. Fresh drifts covered every old footprint, but the storm had moved fast enough that new tracks would still show clearly if someone approached during the night. He stepped out, tightening his coat, the crunch under his boots crisp and sharp. The air smelled clean, too clean. Storms usually left broken branches or pushed loose snow along the fence line. This morning, the ground looked disturbed in a way that didn't sit right with him. He knelt near the rail and brushed away a layer of snow until he found what he suspected, a faint indentation, part of a boot print, half erased by gusts but unmistakably fresh. He stood slowly. Someone had moved close enough to study the cabin during the storm. Inside, Anika lifted her head the moment he returned. She had stayed half awake through most of the night, alert to every shift of wind. Her body was still sore, but the fear was no longer paralyzing. It had changed into something sharper, an awareness that danger was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. "What did you find?" she asked, stepping toward him before he had even removed his coat. Grant shut the door behind him. Someone got near the fence while the storm covered their steps. Not close enough to approach the house, but close enough to watch. Mira, who had been tying her boots in the corner, froze. "Is it Ro?" Grant shook his head slowly. "I can't say, but whoever it was isn't a traveler lost in the snow." Anika felt her pulse hammering in her ears. "They're testing the land, checking how we respond." "Exactly," Grant said, "and I'm not going to wait for them to come knocking." He crossed to the corner where he kept the old marshal's box and opened it again. From inside, he pulled out a strip of folded leather, a small pouch of iron tacks, and a thin coil of line. Anika watched carefully. "What are those for?" she asked. "Perimeter alarms," Grant said. "Simple ones. If someone crosses the back trail, I'll hear it." Anika's eyes narrowed in concern. "They'll know you're preparing for them." "They already know more than I like," Grant replied. "Preparation won't change that. Only our chances of surviving it." He handed Mira a pair of mittens and nodded toward the hearth. "Stay inside until I come back. The fire needs tending every hour." Mira nodded with a seriousness rare in children her age. Grant turned to Anika next. "You're coming with me." She blinked. "My feet are better than they were," he said, "and I need someone who can watch my back." The room held a sudden stillness. For hours she had wondered if he trusted her enough to involve her in anything beyond the cabin's safety. And now he was asking her to stand beside him in the open. She nodded without hesitation. Grant handed her his old wool gloves and pointed to his second rifle, an older lever action he kept oiled but rarely used. "Ever shoot?" "Yes," she said. "My husband taught me." Grant met her eyes for a brief moment that held more understanding than any conversation they'd shared yet. "Then you'll stay close and speak up if anything looks wrong." Anika slung the rifle over her shoulder. "I won't slow you down." He didn't correct her. Something in her tone told him she meant every word. Outside, the snow reached their calves in places, but the sky remained clear, giving them full visibility along the ridge. Grant moved with confidence, scanning the tree line as he walked. Anika followed close behind, adjusting her steps carefully so she wouldn't slip. She had regained some strength overnight. Her breathing was steady, and her feet, though wrapped, held firm beneath her. As they reached the fence line, Grant pointed to the print he had uncovered earlier. Anika knelt, brushing snow aside the way she had seen hunters do. "This is from last night," she said. "Long stride, heavy weight, not a young rider." "Not Ro," Grant murmured. "He's tall, but not heavy." "Maybe one of his men," Anika said. Grant nodded. "That's what worries me." They followed the prints until they faded into a patch of wind-cleared ground. Further ahead, Anika noticed something Grant didn't see from his angle. A broken twig on a low pine branch, snapped clean and bent in the direction of the ridge. She pointed. Someone passed through there. Grant examined it. "Good eye." He continued forward, more alert now, until they reached a point where the ridge curved and provided a full view of the canyon trail below. From this vantage point, they could see movement miles away if their eyes were sharp enough. Grant raised the spyglass. At first, nothing but snow, rock, and scattered pines. Then, far to the southwest, near the old trade road, he saw three shapes. Riders. Slow-moving. Careful. No wagons. He lowered the spyglass and exhaled through his teeth. "What did you see?" Anika asked. "Three men," Grant said. "They're not heading toward us yet. But the way they move, they're scouting, not traveling." Anika's breath caught. "Are they Ro's men?" "I can't confirm from this distance," Grant answered. but the pattern fits. And that means they're mapping the land before closing in. A long, cold silence followed. Anika looked down at the valley, her expression shifting. Not fear, not helplessness, but a steadiness that came from finally knowing the shape of the threat. If they come, will they come at night? Grant shook his head. Roe prefers late afternoon. Enough light to see his target, enough shadows to hide his numbers. Then we prepare for that. Grant glanced at her, surprised by her readiness. You're not afraid. I'm terrified, she said honestly. But I'm done running. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something in his chest tightened in a way he hadn't expected. He admired her courage. Not reckless, not desperate, but grounded in a will to protect Mira and herself. He had seen men crumble with far less pressure. They headed back to the cabin, moving faster this time. Mira waited at the window, face pressed against the glass. The moment they walked through the door, she ran to them, clinging to Anika first, then to Grant. You both came back, she whispered. Of course, Anika said, kneeling to her level. We won't leave you. Grant watched the two of them, snow still clinging to his coat, his breath catching slightly at the sight of Myra's trust. His daughter had accepted Anika completely. That wasn't something he could ignore. Not now, not ever. He removed his gloves and placed them on the table. We've got work to do, he said. By sundown, this ranch will look like a place no one wants to break into. Anika stood, her expression firm. Tell me where to start. Grant handed her a length of rope and motioned toward the beams above the door. We build a barricade that can drop in seconds. And after that, she asked. Grant lifted the spyglass again, checking the ridge. After that, he said quietly, we brace for the moment they decide to stop watching. The air inside the cabin thickened, not with dread, but with readiness. Mira sat at the table, clutching her newest drawing. 3 figures standing together under a simple roof. A man, a woman, a child, together like a family. Grant's eyes lingered on it longer than he meant to. And for the first time since this began, he allowed himself to hope that when danger finally reached the cabin, they would face it as one. Grant worked with a focus that bordered on grim determination. The next hours passed with the 3 of them moving through the cabin and yard, each performing tasks that turned the ranch from an open home into a place prepared for a threat. He taught Anika how to secure the rope release for the door beam, how to spot the difference between a drifting shadow and a moving rider, how to load the lever-action rifle without wasting a single motion. She listened with full concentration, absorbing every detail, because survival had never felt so personal. Mira helped in her own way, gathering small items Grant handed her, placing them where he pointed, and quietly humming as she worked, her presence softening the tension that hung in the room. Grant never let her out of his sight, not even for a moment. He had lost one family once, and he would not relive that nightmare. By late afternoon, the sky shifted into a pale yellow haze, the kind that preceded early winter sunsets. Grant stepped onto the porch and looked toward the ridge with the spyglass. Anika joined him, keeping her steps light in the snow. He lowered the glass slowly. For men now, he said. They're closer. Anika's pulse tightened. Are they Roe's men? 2 of them matched the descriptions you gave. The others are new. She exhaled, steadying herself. What do we do now? Grant's voice remained level. We wait for them to make the first move, but we won't let them reach the porch. He stepped back inside and set the spyglass down. His eyes traveled over the cabin as if committing every angle, every entry, every weak point to memory. Anika sensed something shift in him, something she hadn't seen fully until now. He wasn't just preparing to protect them. He was preparing to protect her. The realization made her stomach tighten with both fear and something unexpectedly warm. The last of the daylight faded, replaced by a blue shadow that crept across the valley. Mira held Anika's hand while watching Grant check the ammunition. Daddy, she said quietly, if they come, will it be loud? Grant crouched beside her. You stay behind the woodbox with Anika. You don't move, you don't speak, you don't open your eyes unless she tells you. Do you understand? Mira nodded, lips pressed together. Anika knelt, and brushed a loose braid from the girl's forehead. "You're safe with us," she whispered. Night settled fully, wrapping the cabin in stillness. Grant extinguished every lantern except one near the stove, leaving the room dim but visible. He stood at the window, shoulders rigid, rifle in his hands, eyes fixed on the ridge. Snow had stopped falling. The silence felt stretched tight, waiting. Then happened. A faint clink of metal echoed from the far side of the fence. Not loud, not hurried, just enough to send Grant's eyes snapping toward the sound. "They're here," he said quietly. Anika moved immediately, guiding Mira to the hiding place behind the woodbox. Grant lifted the door beam partway, preparing the drop. His breathing slowed into a controlled rhythm he had trained into himself years ago. 3 shadows appeared just beyond the yard, dark shapes moving in a slow formation. Grant raised his rifle and aimed through the cracks in the wood. The first man stepped forward, tall, coat lined with a stripe across the arm. Micah Rowe. Grant's jaw hardened. Anika's fingers tightened around Myra's hand instinctively. Rowe lifted a lantern high, the light spilling across the yard until it touched the porch. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me," he called, voice slipping through the cold air like hard steel. "A woman ran from my camp. Tracks led this way." Grant didn't lower the rifle. "Your business ends at the fence." Rowe laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Marshall Holloway," he said loudly, "didn't expect to see you living like a farmer." Anika's heart slammed in her chest. He knew Grant. He knew exactly who he was. Grant didn't move. "You're not stepping foot on my land." Rowe took another step forward. "You got someone inside, don't you?" His eyes drifted toward the faint glow from the window. "A woman who looks damn familiar." Grant dropped the beam in one swift motion, securing the door. "You won't touch anyone here." Rowe motioned to his men. 2 moved outward, circling the yard. 1 lingered near the fence, hand near his revolver. Grant tracked their movements through the window cracks. "Give her back, Marshall," Rowe shouted. "You know how this works. You keep someone who ain't yours. You're a skin for blood." Inside the cabin, Anika pressed a hand over her chest, forcing her breath to stay even. She knew what Rowe wanted. She also knew what kind of man he was: relentless, cruel, and obsessed with taking control. But she refused to let the past steal her courage now. She rose from her hiding place. Grant turned sharply. "Stay down." "No," she whispered, stepping closer. "He wants me, not your daughter." Grant's voice stayed low but fierce. "I'm not handing you over." She reached out and touched his arm. Just a brief, steadying touch. "I'm not asking you to. I'm saying I'm not hiding while you put yourself in front of bullets meant for me." Her voice shook only slightly, but the resolve in her eyes was unmistakable. Grant stared at her, struck by the strength behind her fear. A gun cocked outside. The sound cut through the walls like a blade. Grant moved instantly. "Down," he said, guiding Anika behind the table while keeping the rifle trained on the window. A shadow crossed the porch. Grant fired once. A grunt of pain echoed outside, followed by a body dropping into the snow. Chaos erupted, shouts, boots scrambling, the scrape of metal. Rowe barked orders. Grant fired again, hitting the second man as he climbed the steps. Anika stayed low, covering Mira with her body as the cabin shuddered under gunfire. Snow burst against the windows from bullets striking the outer walls. Rowe shouted again, voice now edged with fury. "You think you can protect her forever?" Grant chambered another round. "Longer than you'll stay breathing." A final burst of gunfire answered him, but Rowe's shots went wide. Grant leaned toward the window, eyes narrowing. He caught sight of Rowe running toward the ridge, alone. "Cowards retreating," Grant muttered. Anika crawled forward cautiously. "Is he leaving?" Grant watched the ridge carefully. The figure grew smaller, disappearing into the trees. "For now," he said, "but he's not coming back." "How do you know?" Anika whispered. "Because men like Rowe only run when they're dying." Anika's breath hitched. "Did you?" Grant lowered the rifle. He took a bullet to the shoulder. "He won't last long in this cold." The cabin fell quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Mira peeked up from her hiding place, eyes wet but brave. "Is it over?" Grant knelt and pulled her into his arms. Yes, he said, voice softening. It's over. Anika stood shakily, relief rushing through her until her knees nearly buckled. Grant caught her arm and steadied her, their breaths close enough to mingle in the cold air. You're safe, he said, the words carrying more weight than anything he'd spoken to her before. She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the last barrier inside her crumble. Because of you, she whispered. Grant shook his head. Because you stood with me. Their eyes met, the tension between them changing from survival to something deeper, quieter, and undeniably real. Grant lifted a hand gently to her face, brushing a strand of hair away. She leaned into the touch, her breath trembling for an entirely different reason now. He kissed her, slow, grounded, filled with everything he hadn't dared feel until this moment. She kissed him back with equal intent, her fingers slipping into the fabric of his coat, as if anchoring herself to the man who had given her safety when she had none. When they finally pulled back, Mira grinned sleepily from the blankets. Does this mean she stays forever?